the Ten Commandments and the law. Yay! We're talking about law this morning. And so, but we're going to bring it back and know that everything that God does, He does for a reason. And He does it because He loves us. And we're going to talk about that. So, you ever watch the Ten Commandments? You always wondered maybe, well, Dave hasn't, right? And Chad has not seen it either. So we're going to have a party just so those two can watch the Charlton Heston version of the Ten Commandments. You ever thought, why were the children of Israel in Egypt? And as we're going through the story, now we understand that there was a famine in the land, that God had raised up Joseph to save the nation, and so they were there to get grain. So I hope you're seeing the dots connect. So this happened because of these events here. And so that's the cool thing about all of this being a part of God's plan. And then it went from there that the children of Israel, they're in Egypt for a while, things are going well, and then a new Pharaoh, a new king, it says in Exodus 1, who didn't know Joseph, and Joseph meant nothing to him, comes into power, and so they enslave the children of Israel. And so last week we talked about a guy named Moses. We talked about deliverance. It says in Numbers 12:3 that Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. And as you recall the conversations God has with Moses, when God says, Moses, you're going to go and you're going to do these, well, like God, slow speech. And He gives him all these things. Well, he was a very humble man. And so that's one of the ways people have often wondered the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Pentateuch, I mispronounced that. But it's the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So here's the thing: if you're public speaking at some point and you don't know how to say it real fast and go on. I pause, but that is true. You're reading names in the Bible that you don't know. Just say it like you think that it is, confidently, and go on. But so this meant the first 5 books. The Jewish people would call this the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Many folks would say maybe that Moses had a part in penning all of that. We don't know that completely, but we do know he was the most humble person on the planet at the time. And Numbers says that, how much of a humble man he was, that he was a great leader. And this morning we found out in the video, we probably always knew this, was the children of Israel, their numbers could have been 1 to 3 million. So sometimes when you watch the Ten Commandments, you see these people coming, and you see a few hundred coming across the Red Sea party. It would have been like taking Chicago across. Isn't that something? I mean, the amount of people, and Moses had to have been a pretty good leader to coordinate that. There were no cell phones. There were no, there was no PA systems and Facebook and saying, to get the people. So he must have been a good leader. God goes to a lot of trouble during this time to let the children of Israel know that He is the real God. He goes to Pharaoh, and again, he tells Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, it says. And then so God begins sending 10 different plagues as a statement. And what I found out myself, and maybe I had heard it but didn't realize, was every one of those plagues were put to show that He's the real God. So when He turned the water into blood, when the frogs came, that was the fertility goddess, was the head of a frog. So God brought frogs. So everything He did was to orchestrate that He is the great God. And He did that to show the children of Israel as well as the Egyptians. So the Red Sea parts, the Pharaoh, he decides, what have I done? We talked about that too. You got to understand, this was free labor. So in his budget that he probably did every year, there's no labor cost. And suddenly all these children of Israel are leaving. And his labor costs are going to skyrocket to do what he's doing. And I'm assuming Chad pointed out, HR is probably in there going, what have you done? And so he changes his mind and he goes after him. And then of course, all of the armies, the Red Sea falls in on all of the armies and they drowned. God proceeds to take care of the children of Israel. He gives them manna. He gives them meat. So this week we go to Mount Sinai, and it's time for God to make good on His promise of His covenant to Abraham. Remember Abraham a while back? We talked about him and the covenant that God made. Now is the time. God's going to make good on that. He's going to raise up a nation that's going to save the world. Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, and in chapter 5 of the story. I'll read that this morning. It's up on the screen. It says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God's saying to his people, he says, I got this plan, I want you back. And he said, I want to come down, I want to dwell with you. But in order to do that, there's some guidelines that I need to give you. And that's kind of what chapter 5 is. It's this transitional point that God's going to give them some guidelines. He's going to connect with them in a way he hasn't really done since the Garden of Eden. So if you're looking at the story, everything has built up to this point, of Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments. God says, but for me to, he says, for me to do this, he says there's some things that we just have to work out between you and me. So there's two types of covenants there in your notes that God made with his people. The first one is an unconditional covenant. An unconditional covenant is like as a parent. Our kids come in and there's this unconditional love that we would have. We're going to love that child unconditionally. It's like the covenant that God made with Abraham. He gave him the land. He said, you're going to be the father of many nations. You're going to have an heir. I'm going to give you a son. It's this unconditional type of covenant. And the second one, of course, is conditional. A conditional covenant. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So it's one that has conditions on it. So maybe, your son or daughter does really well with grades, and then the promise is, I'll buy you a new car. I can't imagine that, but it seems like that happens. I look where my son goes to school, and there's way nice cars in there for kids that are that age, but it's a contract that, doing your homework or doing chores, brushing your teeth, they're all things, with a covenant, it's good for you, but there's conditions on it. It's a way of helping out. So we're going to talk about the beginning of the law. And I want you to understand this, that there's nothing that God doesn't ask us to do that's really good for him. I mean, when he asked for the blood offering, he wasn't looking for a lamb to be slaughtered because he was hungry. It didn't affect him if we commit murder or even worship other gods, because it didn't affect him. God wanted our hearts all along. That's what the story is about. That's the upper story. God wanted our hearts, our love, and that's why he created us, and we know that. Again, Exodus 19, I'll reread verses 5 and 6. It just says, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. And although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God's putting this nation together. Love this. And have you ever referred to the upper story and the lower story? We talked about that in Sunday school as well. Knowing that God has this story. He's written. Right? You and I aren't here by mistake. We're here because of the lower story. So everything that we do feeds into the story that he's already written. We have access to God, that they're going to have access to God that no one else has had. This nation that God is creating. Jesus is going to actually come from this. And see, all this is building. We're going through all of these things, making a nation and doing all these things. And out of this, Jesus is going to raise up and he's going to come. And we know, because we still have the cross and the implications of the blood sacrifice once and for all. It's absolutely amazing out of this covenant. So let's go to Mount Sinai. We go to Mount Sinai, and God tells Moses, I want to come, I want to hang out with you. In Exodus 20, 18 and 19, it says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and smoke, they trembled with fear. They knew God was on that mountain. It says they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but did not have God speak to us or we will die. So they were fearful of God that was up on the mountain. So they lived in this fear. They had this great fear of God. He had parted the Red Sea and he had performed all of these miracles. But ultimately they get Moses together and they say, Moses, you deal with this. We don't want to. We're in fear of this God, even this God that had delivered us. They're afraid of his greatness. to be in his presence. You would think the rest of the story would turn out differently, but we all know probably what's going to happen. So he goes up to the mountain and he talks to God. Moses comes down from the mountain and he shares the Ten Commandments, right, with the people. God has said to both he and Aaron in Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 through 17, it says, I am the Lord, I read part of it, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And he begins telling them the commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any idol for worshiping. You shall not take my name in vain or make it empty. You shall remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So if you notice, the first 4 commandments are about our relationship with God. Almost half of the other 10 are allowing other gods to not allowing other gods to take the place of the one true God. So he goes to great lengths to tell this nation that's starting, remember me. Remember the miracles I did. Remember in Egypt, and remember me going against the magicians and all of that. And my serpent ate the serpent that was created from the magicians. And I am the one true God. And he says, do not have any other gods before me. The next 6 are about each other. Honor your father and mother. You shouldn't murder. You should not be an adulterer. You should not steal. You should not falsely accuse a neighbor. You should not covet anything. So when we wonder what the great commandment is, right? Love the Lord your God. The first 4 commandments, love the Lord your God with everything you have. And the second part, the next 6, is love your neighbor as yourself. See, so out of these commandments comes the great commandment. Jesus says, if you're gonna keep everything, you love me with everything. But then the next 6, you treat others like you would want them to be treated, and love other people as well. Exodus 19:8, and I put this up on the screen. It says, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses comes down, or Moses has these things. Everybody says, we'll do this. That's been told to us. He says, I'll write these down so you always have them. So God leaves his brother Aaron, which we talk about. Aaron was the second leader behind. Meanwhile, at the ranch, when God goes back, what's happening down here? Moses goes down here, what's happening? And they're having this party. They begin asking all kinds of questions. Where's Moses? He's been gone a long time. Maybe, is he still alive? It's been 40 days before he comes back down with the written copy. Exodus 32:1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. You see how quick they changed? They talked about, we're going to do this, and they saw the miracles, and they saw God in his mighty hand, and the great lengths that he went to say, I am the one true God. But it's not happening fast enough. I think we need, maybe we just need to go make gods who were for us, because that's what they saw in Egypt. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. So in other words, give us something that we can worship. So Aaron gets this bright idea. I bet he looked on it after that and thought, man, that was stupid. You ever had those? I got an idea. Everybody's complaining. I'm going to fix this problem. So he says, we're going to bring all the earrings and all the gold and we're going to melt it down. Exodus 32:3-7, it says, so all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and he made it into an idol, cast in the shape of a cow, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. You ever just thick tongue in the morning? Revelry. Sometimes it's just way too early to say words that just don't flow. I should have had an adjective for that. So they're partying, in other words. There's massive parties going on. I did make notice of this, and it's not in your notes, but idol worship is usually not about replacing God with another God. It's about replacing God with us. Idol worship isn't as much replacing God with another God. It's about replacing God with us. And how does something like that happen, especially with the children of Israel? I mean, they saw God. Man, can you imagine can you imagine several million people walking across the Red Sea that's been parted? And then right after that, when the armies come to chase them, it encloses it, and the armies of Egypt all die. And you saw that. You saw the light that guided them. You saw the food that came down that God promised. You saw the water that was clean. All of the provision of God. And suddenly, because things aren't happening fast enough or they don't understand, they revert back to their old way of thinking. They start telling Moses, or they start telling Aaron, we should have just died back there at the hands of the Egyptians. At least we knew what was coming. Moses gets halfway down the mountain. So he comes up, and his white hair, he goes up, and his hair is, at least in the movies, he comes down, he goes up there, his hair is brown or whatever, comes back, and it's white. He's been in the presence of God. So he comes down halfway and begins hearing music. And they're partying like 19... Anybody? Thank you. They're partying like it's 1999. That is a song for those of you that are a little younger. I think it was Prince, if I remember right. So it's kind of this Woodstock on steroids type of thing. And I'm a little young for Woodstock, but I remembered it was just a big party with bands and all of those things. And it says in Exodus 32:17 and 18 that when Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." Moses replied, "It is not the sound of victory, and it's not the sound of defeat." So the closer he gets, he sees this golden calf and this wild party. Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments, and we know what he does. He gets so irate that he smashes down the Ten Commandments. You know, before we get judgmental about idols, let's look at our own life. That's the one thing that I see in Scripture. We read and we go, what were they thinking? How could they begin worshiping a golden calf when they saw... But let's step back for a moment and let's look at my life and your life. Nancy Ortberg says there's 4 ways we can distinguish if something's become an idol, and we're going to spend a few minutes on that. Number 1, idol reflects the culture that you live in. An idol reflects the culture that you live in. So the children of Israel, for the longest time, they saw the golden calf. It wasn't far removed from their thinking because that was the culture that they lived in. And so what did they do? As soon as God didn't do what they thought he should do, as soon as they didn't know where Moses was at, they reverted back to what they culturally knew. They thought he had forsaken them. What is it that non-Christ followers in my culture worship? And I can name a lot of things, right? We don't build things out of gold, but we have a lot of idols. We turn to the familiar to fill our needs, and it makes it an idol. So number 2, if there's a repetitive nature to it, it could be an idol. We find stress and crisis or boredom creeps in our life, and we're driven back to the thing that we gave up. Right? Crisis sometimes drives people back to the idol they gave up because there's comfort in knowing that. It's like addictions. It's repetitive. The Old Testament was full of behaviors like that. It's an addictive nature to idols, and it's not easy to get rid of. And it happens sometimes in moments of stress, like the children of Israel. What are we going to do? God's forsaken us. We don't, Moses, and all of those things. Let's revert back to what we know. Number 3, it competes with who God is. An idol competes with who God is. Verse 8 tells us in chapter 32 that God's voice of punishment on the people was that they were quick to turn aside from him and quick to worship another god. So the minute something got bad, they even though they saw what he did and his goodness and how he is the great God, they were quick to turn and to worship another god. Matthew chapter 6 says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Also says in 6:24 of Matthew that no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. How can we tell if something is obscuring and competing for God's attention in my life? I worship it. It gets all my attention. I feed it. Think about our culture. See, we're not adverse from the children of Israel. I see it. Sports, it's an idol. I can say it's an idol in Mount Zion. I've been there. I've seen parents that are Christian parents that have put sports before their God. And it's not just Mount Zion. That's where I live. Money, it's an idol, right? I've seen people that give everything they can to their career. And guess what? There's nothing wrong with that. God wants us to work hard. But he says, I'm the one true God. I'm the one that gives you the ability to get wealth. It's when I turn my attention to something other than God. When I'm worshiping something other than God, then it's an idol. God's very harsh about what he says. Ezekiel 16 says, he uses the very harsh analogy of harlotry. For the children of Israel, when they are torn away from God, and they put their attention on the idols. He says, you give all your gifts, all of your best to these lovers. Harlotry, and that's what he likens it to. And then number 4, an idol will be surrounded by rationalizations and excuses. You rationalize it, you have an excuse. You know, I know that I don't spend the time with God I need to, but my son, one of these days, is going to be the next, Aaron Rodgers. He has the talent. I see it. And so I know what I'm going to do. It's a rationalization. It's an excuse for not worshiping the one true God, right? And we probably all have made that. Listen to what Aaron says in Exodus 32. He says, Moses comes down and he says, do not be angry, my Lord. Aaron answered, you know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. So Aaron is making excuses for the decision he made and for the people. It says Exodus 32:24. So I told them, whoever has gold jewelry, take it off. Then they gave me the gold and I threw it to the fire. And out came this calf. It just happened. He's rationalizing, okay, so here's what they thought, and they were getting angry. I feared for my life. I'm making these excuses. This is why we're doing this, Moses. Kind of sounds like an excuse to the 6-year-old. You ever seen little kids make excuses? I mean, it's cute. And then they get to be 16. Not as cute anymore, right? Just not. So Aaron, of course, he's not been a great leader. He's not taking any blame for anything. He's rationalizing. Again, idols, right? Materialism. I mean, relationships. And all these things are not bad. Money's not bad. A good relationship, even with our wives and our spouses, is great. But God says, when it takes the place over me, then it's wrong and it's an idol. See, all the things that we make as idols, they're not these statues that we're bowing down to worship. They're good things, a lot of them. Many are good things. But the minute that you and I take something that God ordained for good and we put everything we have and we worship it and we spend our time feeding it, then God says that's wrong. And Scripture says He's a jealous God. We got to hunger more for God. And again, many of these things aren't even bad things. Psalms 106:21 says they worship the golden calf because they forgot God. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:14, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. Paul's saying, look, run, Forrest, run, and run as fast as you can. Remember Joseph? When Bathsheba, the hottie, she's coming after him, she wants to sleep with him, it says he fled temptation. Now it's saying we need to flee idolatry. The minute that we see it rise up, we need to bury that thing. The minute we see that money has a hold on us, that it's not just a means that God, here's what God intended for money. He blesses us so that we are a blessing. That it isn't supposed to take all of our time. And so we can, it's loving God and spending time with God. And He gives us the ability for wealth and relationships and all of those things that God made for good. Satan makes for bad. Right? And that's what Satan does. He perverts everything that God has done, that God has said is good. So what does Moses do? He gets mad. Not only does he break the Ten Commandments, which is going to have huge ramifications for him, right? And those guys later, he also melts the calf down and he puts it in their water supply. So they got to drink this bitter water. I mean, this guy's mad. You can imagine, he's with God and he's leading the people and he's irate at what he's seeing. I think probably it's kind of like a mom washing the kid's mouth out with soap, but on a huge scale with millions of people. Right? Because he's trying to get his point across. So, Matthew 7:11. When we're talking about covenant, it says, if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? This is the point I want you to see, that everybody talks about law, and some people are just, it's legalism. God gave us laws for a reason. It's because he loves us. He wants that relationship. He doesn't want anything coming in my life or yours, any idol that's going to diminish that relationship that he wants from us. He wants with us. He wants our acknowledgement of his creation and his purpose. He wants us to love him with everything we have because we've seen he is the one and only true God. Isn't that the way we all are with our kids? We're that way. I know when Jacob was born, I was like, Jacob, you need to follow me. I'm your dad. You don't have to follow every other dad that's out there. Follow me because, I have your best interest in all of those things. And that's the way God is. God says, look, follow me. You don't understand. There's lots of pitfalls out there. There's lots of things you can fall into and temptations and idols. Follow me. I have your best interest. Remember, I wrote the upper story. You're just living this lower story out here. When God says keep the Sabbath. Why? Because our bodies need rest. Honoring our father and mother and not murder and adultery and stealing, all of those protect us because who's ever broken one of those? There's consequences and it hurts. And God says, I want to protect you. I want to protect you from that. He put rules in because he's a designer, the architect. He knows how all of this works. Scholars have found that 200 of the 600 commands found in the first 5 books of the Old Testament were regulations that ensured the good health of the people. So a lot of the laws, even in the first 5 books, were about keeping people healthy. They didn't understand germs and all the things that we probably do now. God did. And he said, don't do this and don't do that. They didn't understand it, but God had their best interest at heart. Because Father knows best. And he's building a nation of people. And he's going to great lengths. So this morning, I want us to stop viewing God as this nasty rule maker. I get so aggravated when Christians present, they're talking to people and everything's about the law. Right? Man, God's going to pounce on you and you got to do this and it's legalism. It never was about legalism with God. It was about God going, okay, here's what you do because this is best for you and it keeps that relationship that I want to have more than anything in your life. It keeps it fresh and it keeps it vibrant. Psalm 106:19 through 22. They made a calf and worshipped an idol cast for metal. They exchanged their glorious God for an image of a bull, which eats grass. They forgot the God who saved them, who had done great things in Egypt, miracles in the land of Ham, and awesome deeds by the Red Sea. The psalmist says, why would you choose a golden cow over the one and only glorious God? It's a fair question, right? So as we end this morning, the question I have for you is, are you choosing a cow over our glorious God? Because it's so easy to do. Right? Maybe we don't build idols and we don't have statues, but some of us worship something other than the one true God. So this morning as we end, are you choosing a cow over our glorious God? Because the psalmist looks, and remember David was the man that after God's own heart. He looked and goes, how in the world could you worship that? You have access to the real God. The God that created, the God that had the upper story, the God that spoke and everything was. So bring it home to us. Why would we ever worship something artificial? Why would we ever let a relationship